So over 10 years, there were more complaints than we have ophthalmologists.
Welcome to EyeCan, a podcast about ophthalmology through a uniquely Canadian lens with Dr. Serare Ziai and myself, Dr. Guillermo Rocha.
This season, we have two new co-hosts joining us, Dr. Mona Dagger and Dr. Hadi Saheb. They'll be hosting upcoming episodes throughout the season. Season 3 of the EyeCan podcast is brought to you by Bayer Ophthalmology. Thank you for your support. On this episode of EyeCan, we are pleased to introduce our listeners to Dr. Rishi Gupta, Associate Professor in the Department of Ophthalmology and Visual Sciences in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Dr. Gupta, my dear friend, attended medical school at the University of Toronto, completed his ophthalmology residency training at the University of Ottawa, and received his Vitreoretinal Fellowship from McGill University. He actively participates in research and has over 50 publications in prominent peer-reviewed journals.
He has received awards for his work in medical education, research, teaching, surgical videos, as well as excellence in patient care. Dr. Gupta's book, Reflections of a Pupil, was named one of the top must-have books for beginning ophthalmologists and has become required reading in some residency programs. And beyond being a respected colleague, Rishi Gupta is a good friend to both Serare and myself. Has some overlap in training. He was a co-resident of Serare's at the University of Ottawa, and also a fellow at McGill University, where I work. And so we've both gotten to know Rishi Gupta quite well, and are so excited to have him here tonight, sharing with us his, I hope not too much experience with complaints, but at least his thinking about complaints and how to help our colleagues and our listeners with thinking about complaints. So welcome to the EyeCan podcast, Dr. Gupta.
Hadi and Serare, so nice to see you, and thank you so much for having me on.
So open-ended question to start. Why do you think we get complaints?
Okay, so let's think about complaints in 3 categories. The first category we're going to call front page news. These are the big ones. So gross incompetence and negligence, and egregious lapses in judgment that are often going to relate to money, sex, and power. You've got these complaints commandments, if you will. So thou shalt not overbill, overcharge, or commit fraud. Thou shalt not have an intimate relationship with or be abusive to patients, staff, or trainees. And these may all seem obvious and something we think we're immune to, but to err is human. And there are examples of all of these complaints within Canadian ophthalmology. There's actually 2 books that I think every ophthalmologist should read. So the first one is called Waking Up Blind by Tom Harbin, and this centers on Dwight Kavanagh, former chair at Emory. And the second one is called Bad City by Paul Pringle. That spotlights on Carmen Pulafito, former chair at USC. And these are fascinating and unnerving reads. Have either of you read these books?
I've read the first one you mentioned, Rishi.
I haven't read the second book, but I've read, significant content about the second topic.
Yeah, so in these books, we see themes of wrong eye surgery, surgery on eyes with no pathology, chart alterations, billing fraud, substance abuse, abuse of power, and profanely unprofessional and criminal behavior. So that's your category 1. Category 2, we're going to go to the opposite end of the spectrum. The complaints that we're going to call nothing to see here, folks. These are the ones that are completely frivolous. So someone complains that at a visit, the soap had run out in the washroom, there's dust in the corner, but they felt the front desk's response was snarky. So yes, not ideal, but maybe not worthy of a college complaint. So the last category we'll call, there's something there. It's not the egregious misstep. It's not the frivolous nothing, but there's something there. And sometimes the college determines that there's more there, and sometimes the college concludes that there's less. This could be a procedural mishap, a lapse in clinical care and follow-up, a poor outcome or poor communication. And the last one, we see this as the bulk of many of our complaints with this perceived unprofessional demeanor and speech, or perceived lack of time spent answering questions and educating. And of course, these categories are not mutually exclusive.
Which of those categories which is the most common one, would you say, from your knowledge on this topic?
Yeah, I think we're going to see category 3 being the most common. So It's the one there's something there. And communication, if you look at themes that come out of complaints, probably communication is one of the biggest ones.
And so it seems that complaints will most likely come from patients, but are patients the only people who can file complaints? And whoever does decide to complain, where is the typical outlet for that complaint?
Yeah, that's a great question, Hattie. So really anyone can file a complaint against a physician. Just like you said, often it's the patient themselves. However, it could be someone on behalf of the patient, such as a friend or a family member or power of attorney. A third person may file a complaint, interestingly, on behalf of a patient with or without the patient's consent. And it can even come from an organization like Workers' Compensation Board or a government agency such as the Department of Health and Wellness. In some cases, of course, a complaint against a physician comes from another physician or another healthcare worker, or even a trainee. Now, the majority of these complaints are going to go to the Provincial College of Surgeons and Physicians, with a smaller number going to the hospital where the physician works. And alternatively, a physician may be the subject, of course, of a lawsuit where the patient hires a malpractice lawyer and submits for legal proceedings. Much less commonly, a physician may be subject to a criminal investigation. And again, these are not mutually exclusive. I think it's interesting to note that the cost of entry for a college complaint is free, right? The patient does not have to pay anything, and the college is obligated to look at every complaint. You contrast that to the price of hiring a lawyer to take a physician to court for damages, so you can see why the majority of complaints end up being college complaints. And I think at this point, it's also important to say that, of course, the college serves an important role of protecting the public. And the fact that we're a self-regulating profession is a privilege, not a right. We need to maintain the public's trust. And while the vast majority of physicians are practicing ethically, there has to be a mechanism to curb inappropriate behavior.
So we talked a little bit, you told us about who can file a complaint, but what normally happens, Rishi, after a complaint has been filed? So you'd hear about it as the physician, and then what are the different pathways that can occur? What are some of the scenarios that happen after that?
So each province will have its differences in process. So I'll just talk in general terms. Let's say you get a college complaint, you contact the CMPA right away for guidance. A physician advisor, a lawyer, will help you craft a written response to the complaint. The person lodging the complaint can respond to your letter, and thereafter you have the opportunity to respond to that. The investigation committee reviews all this. They'll review, of course, the chart. They'll gather any other information they feel is relevant. And then they may make the decision based just on this. Alternatively, you may be asked to meet in person with a hearing committee. In making the decision, the committee will also look at your history of complaints. So if a physician has multiple complaints on the same issue, of course, that may be a concern. And then once everything has been reviewed, there are a variety of possible outcomes. So number one, the complaint may be dismissed. Second possibility is that advice may be given. So the college will close the complaint, but give written or verbal advice. For example, Dr. X is reminded to be professional in all communications with patients. The third outcome is a caution. So here a warning is issued to the physician on their conduct, and this is recorded on their file. The physician may be ordered sometimes to take specific training to improve skills or practice. For example, if there were significant deficiencies in documentation noted, the physician may be asked to take part in a medical record keeping course. So option 4 is a reprimand. This is a finding of professional misconduct, and that's entered on a physician's formal disciplinary record, and this is made public. And this can come with sanctions, including suspension of license, ongoing restrictions or conditions, mandatory training, fines, or health assessment. And then, of course, we also have the option of a revocation of license. So those are the various outcomes that we might see.
Rishi, do you have any data on the frequency of each of those, whether in ophthalmology or medicine as a whole?
Yeah, so we have a little bit of data that we could look at. The CMPA, they show that complaints against all physicians are on the rise. We do know that ophthalmologists get more college complaints per capita than other surgical specialties. And we know that ophthalmologists get less lawsuits than other surgical specialties. So let's look at some interesting numbers. So in 2018, I'll tell you that there were almost 1,300 ophthalmologists across the country covered by the CMPA. So Hattie and Cedere, I want you each give me a guess. So how many complaints do you think the CMPA handled over a 10-year period? That's from 2009 to 2018. And so again, 1,300 total ophthalmologists. How many complaints do you think the CMPA handled?
I'm thinking 100.
I was going to say 150 or 200.
So not bad guesses, but quite far off. The actual number was 1,325. So over 10 years, there were more complaints than we have ophthalmologists. And if we look at the divide, as we mentioned, the college complaint is the one that has a much lower barrier of entry. So 75% of these complaints were college complaints and 25% were lawsuits. So the CMPA data from, again, 2009 to 18 shows that about half of complaints and lawsuits were actually dismissed. Most others received advice or caution, and only about 2% received disciplinary action. Now that's CMPA data. We also have data from Ontario's college. There was a very nice study published in CJO in 2020 by Drs. Yvonne Buys and Ed Margolin. And in 5 years, so from 2013 to 2018, half of all Ontario ophthalmologists received at least one complaint. If we look at the divide of these, 70% were dismissed, 20% had advice, and about 5% received a caution. 4% received a plan for remediation or continuing medical education, and then only 1% went on to discipline committee. So if we look at this, while the majority are dismissed, I will say again, there are examples in Canadian ophthalmology of revocation of license for fraudulent billing, revocation of license for boundary issues, suspension of license for double billing services privately and publicly, restriction of the number of patient encounters per day, and mandatory monitoring and review of one's charts and practice by a college-appointed assessor.
Is there something specific about ophthalmology, Rishi, that brings about these numbers, or like something we need to think about when we're with our patients that would help us minimize our risk?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, here are my thoughts. I think traditionally we are a high volume specialty. We see a lot of patients in clinic. And if you have more patient encounters, that means from a numbers perspective, there may be more of a chance that any one of those individual encounters leads to a complaint. And with high volumes, it's conceivable that at times we may also spend less time with our patients. And more contracted communication has the risk for miscommunication and a patient's perspective that we have not spent adequate time explaining and answering questions. Now, not only are we high volume in clinic, but we're also high volume procedure-wise as well. Think cataract surgeries, minor procedures, lasers, injections, etc. So these scenarios are somewhat higher stakes in a sense for complaint, particularly if we have an error, complication, or poor outcome. So I think those are some considerations that may contribute.
So are you saying to minimize our chances, we need to communicate more or better?
I think that's a great thought.
Rishi, I want to unpack that comment a little bit, because I think many of us who have spent part of our training in the US have all commented on, medicine occasionally being practiced more defensively in the US, and perhaps some things that, healthcare professionals say there or investigate are not necessarily evidence-based, but more so, from a defensive standpoint to protect against a potential lawsuit or complaint. And I'm just wondering, as you've put so much thought into this topic, if you feel there are moments that you're managing an interaction or a diagnostic workup in a way that you wouldn't normally if the idea of the complaint wasn't lingering in the background of your thoughts.
I think it's a balance that we have to have. I think you can't be all the way on one side practicing only defensive medicine, but it certainly has to be in the back of your mind. I think if you keep the patient as the primary goal and ensuring that they have as good an experience as possible and minimizing their harm as much as possible and errors as much as possible, then those guiding features are hopefully going to lead you down the right path. You mentioned the communication piece, and I thought a lot about communication. And I think one big thing about communication is it doesn't all have to happen in the same sitting. So I think all of us get our spidey sense going, and we all kind of know when things are falling apart. The patient's frustrated, or they're, overly anxious or emotionally charged in some way. What I've learned over time is separating myself from that specific instance is very helpful. I often will call that patient either that evening or the next day and just give it another chance. And just by separating ourselves from that moment, I'm able to, I find in general, bridge that gap a little better. And sometimes it's just that I was, not explaining things well. Sometimes it was that I was rushed. I had to run to the OR or something like that. So I typically start with, apologizing. And then we go into it. And by and large, I find that a lot of times when my spidey sense goes off, that the communication is falling apart, I'm able to, at a later juncture in time, bring things back together. And so I'm not doing that all with the goal of, my goodness, this is going to be a complaint. I'm doing it with the goal of trying to get, a better experience for that patient. But there's no doubt that in those instances, my documentation is much, much more involved and thorough on the off chance that it does become a complaint, so that I have everything written there to help me in my defense.
I remember hearing that advice at a previous presentation by you, and I really find it fantastic advice, because the dust has settled for you, for them, and you're able to reconnect and kind of rebuild that alliance between the patient and the physician. And I think that's just such wonderful advice, and I've used it since I've heard you talk about this. So thanks for sharing that again.
EyeCan wants to know what you think. Please send your comments on today's episode or any suggestions you may have for topics or features to communications@cos-sco.ca, and we'll try to incorporate them into future episodes.
I'm Dr. Vivian Yin, and I listen to EyeCan.
Rishi, what advice do you have to doctors who receive a complaint?
Yeah, so there's a movie from the late 90s called Fight Club, where Brad Pitt famously says, the first rule of Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club. And the second rule of Fight Club is, Hattie, is that right? Do you remember?
I just remember Brad Pitt in that movie.
The second rule of Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club. So the first rule of a complaint is you should call the CMPA. And the second rule of getting a complaint is, say it with me, you should call the CMPA. And they will guide you step by step through the process. Do not call the patient. Do not send a rash response to the college. Do not pull the chart. You may actually not be the custodian of the chart, so be careful with that. And definitely do not alter the chart in any way, or you could lose your credibility and you can sink yourself that way. So bottom line, call the CMPA, let the physician advisor help you. You've already paid for this service, and so you may as well make use of it.
Okay, so call the CMPA. That's step one. I think that's been ingrained in our minds since medical school. So that's a good first step. This is probably the worst feeling for many physicians, is when they receive a complaint. Do we have any data or studies or research on what the actual effect on physician wellness is and how long that lingers? Because sometimes these complaints can linger for months, even years. And I remember one of my girlfriends went through this, and it was just, it really led to some pretty severe mental health effects that went on for years afterwards while she was trying to deal with it. What do we know about the effect on physician wellness of receiving a complaint?
No doubt. I mean, we did a COS webinar on the topic of complaints 2 years ago, and Hattie had helped out with that. We polled the audience, and 40% said it was the most stressful thing they've dealt with in their career, right? And another 50% said it was moderately stressful. Complaints, we know they bring about feelings of shame and anger, fear, frustration, anxiety, and depression. And like you say, Cedric, one of the toughest parts of this is that the complaint can take a long time to come to a resolution. So it can just hang over your head for months to even years. So I'll tell you a personal story. So I received a complaint in the mail August 2017, and my heart was pounding when I read the letter, and I was angry and I was scared. And in the days and months that followed, I became depressed. I laid in bed day and night, consumed by the process. And my stress was so severe that I, a retina specialist, developed central serous retinopathy. So now, not only was I worried about the complaint, but I was terrified about my vision and whether I'd have full recovery. It took 9 months before the complaint was resolved. And through that whole period, I was just not myself. So, everyone's different and will cope differently, but generally a complaint has a very negative impact on physician wellness. So there was a UK survey of about 8,000 physicians, and they found that actually suicidal ideation was more than twice as likely in those with a recent or ongoing complaint. So there's no doubt that this is, going to play a huge effect on physician wellness.
Rishi, what an incredible story, and thanks for sharing that. It must be tough to even think about it. I'm wondering, how somebody like you, a skilled surgeon, surrounded by people looking up to you, learning from you, so much going for you. Can you share what about that single complaint in your, hundreds and thousands of patient encounters made it so difficult for you? And of course, you're not alone. Most people who are having complaints, and I share a similar experience to you, go through have a similar reaction. But as you take a step back and say, okay, this is a single patient encounter amongst hundreds or thousands of patient encounters that led to a complaint. Why do you think we get so affected by this experience?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. Number one, we're so used to success, and this is a very obvious failure. I consider myself a relatively intelligent person, and yet I wasn't able to figure out how to treat this person so they had a good experience. So there was definite, frustration and disappointment there. There was anger, quite frankly, right? There was, I'm doing my best here. I'm trying to, give you up-to-date treatment, and almost how dare you, right, do this? And then, of course, there's shame. You're so embarrassed by this thing. What are my colleagues going to think? What's my mom going to think, if she finds out? And so you just want to bury it. Then, of course, there's the fear side. So you have no idea what's going to happen, right? At the end of the day, if this goes in front of a panel of human beings, are they going to see it the way I see it? Or are they going to look at it a different way? And so what are the consequences of that, right? Is this going to be public knowledge? Is there going to be, a reprimand in any way? Or is this going to be dismissed? So there's a lot of thoughts, running through your head. And I think everyone thinks about all of these things. And for me in particular, I think what really drove me into a bigger depression was the fact that I then had to stop working. So I had all this time laying in bed, just thinking about this complaint, what it was going to mean for me. I had a lot of spare time just mulling over it, which was terrible. And of course, then I was also mulling over, a condition that mostly will resolve on its own in a very favorable way. But I have patients where that's not the case. And if I lost vision in one eye, what does that mean for my career? What does that mean for my family? What does that mean for my finances? So I had a lot going on in my head.
Wow. And anything to share about how you recovered and kind of came out the other side? Any moments, any aha moments along your, we'll call it recovery, that you can share with us and our listeners that helped you be in a better place?
There were a couple of things. So one was definitely talking about it, speaking with trusted mentors and colleagues who then in turn shared, their experiences with complaints. So in that manner, you're not alone. It's happened to other people. So that was very helpful. I think then too, taking the approach, once the dust has settled, once all the anger had sort of faded a bit, and actually looking at it just sort of from a process perspective, trying to look at it intelligently and from a growth mindset perspective, what could I actually learn from it? And I think here is someone, despite my efforts, that did not have a positive experience. And so what is it that I could learn from this? What is it I could take away? I started looking at it as a problem that needed a solution, and rather than getting caught up in all the emotional side of things, trying to remove the emotion and look at it more analytically. I think that helped me as well.
So Rishi, I had a complaint a few years ago, and although I was fortunate to not have any visual impact from the experience, I certainly was quite distraught by it. And I found that focusing on the positive patient interactions that I continue to have on a daily basis helped a lot. Because when you initially receive it, I think one of the reactions is, am I incapable to communicate well with the patient? Am I incapable of making sure patients are comfortable and confident with the physician-patient relationship? And so you have all this self-doubt as you're going through it, and being able to enjoy the dozens of positive interactions you have with patients on a daily basis really helped. And so I at least for me, that was something really useful.
It's really true what they say, that you don't remember all of the nice things people say to you, but you do remember the one negative comment. And this is just expanded example of that same experience we have in life in general. Thank you for sharing, both of you. Dr. Gupta, do you have any last thoughts for us on this topic?
Yeah, sure. I'll say be vigilant, be safe, and be smart. So be vigilant is, after you've been doing this stuff a long time or long enough, you can probably do most of it in your sleep. And there's a risk of kind of going on autopilot. My old fellowship mentor, Mike Capusta, he always used to say, as soon as you get casual, you'll have an office full of mistakes. So I think we need to keep our focus and be vigilant. Want to be safe. So, figure out what you can handle safely and make sure you have what you need around you to keep your patients safe from error and harm. I always tell our residents, you look at others around you, and other people might be seeing, 100 patients a day or 200 patients a day, and 40 cataracts in a day, for example. And you may be able to do that safely, but I think it's important to reflect on it and see what resources you have around you and make sure that you're able to do that and not have things, in a place where the wheels might fall out. And then be smart is, again, I always talk about that spidey sense. If you feel that an interaction hasn't gone well, two things. One is, see if you can touch base again with that patient at a later juncture in time, try and bridge that gap. And also, remember, documentation is going to be really, really important if things unfortunately go the wrong way. And I think if you take one thing away from this podcast, I think our listeners need to remember that complaints are common. A complaint is probably going to be stressful, and it's probably going to hang around for a long time. That you shouldn't bury it and tackle it secretly on your own. You should lean on your mentors, colleagues, friends, family, and the CMPA for support. So know that it's coming and know that you're not alone.
Great. Thank you so much, Rishi, for your wisdom and your sharing your knowledge on this topic that I think we all think about, but that's just, probably best to remember more often so that we keep it in the back of our minds. And I think the most important message is that you're not alone when this happens. And I think you've relayed that very accurately to all of our listeners. We like to end with something a little bit lighter. We'd like to ask all of our guests if they want to share with us, what books they're reading at this moment, what podcasts they listen to, something about their life outside of work. So we'd love to learn a little bit about what you do in your spare time.
Okay, so just like the two of you, I don't have a lot of spare time. Most of my life is a blur of bathing, brushing, feeding, wiping bums, and shuttling around these three little maniacs. But I'm very, very excited that Anu and I, my wife and I, have finished off our first children's book with my amazing editor, Cynthia Lank, and beautiful illustrations by Katie Junn. We're really thrilled with it and totally in love with it. It's this very special book because it's a birthday book for ages sort of 2 to 7. And secondly, it's an interactive book, meaning that the child and the adult move through the story with imaginative play, interacting directly with the book. So if you know your children's books, think Press Here by Hervé Toulet. So yeah, it's a really exciting thing for us, and all proceeds from each book sold in 2023 we're going to send to the Halifax IWK Children's Hospital. So the book is called Milk, Eggs, Butter, and Broccoli.
Well, Rishi, you've got a buyer. As of tonight, you're going to have one extra purchase. That's incredible. Rishi and I are almost timed for children and gender. We both have 2 boys and a girl, and almost the same ages. So I'm listening to you in absolute awe that you found the time to do this with Anu, because our lives just seem like endless amounts of craziness and magic all at the same time. So kudos to you and Anu for getting that done. And I just want to echo what Cedare said. You know, you've shared so much great advice and information about, one, how to take care of patients better, have better patient experiences, and through that, reduce the risk of complaints, and also kind of being very realistic and transparent about the fact that it's likely going to happen. It happens to the best of us, and to have our listeners hear from somebody as capable and respected as you have to go through such an experience, I hope is reassuring to those that will go through a similar experience, and to remind them they're not alone, and to count on those around them to get through these difficult moments. So really, thanks a ton. I found this conversation really useful and enlightening.
Thank you so much to both of you. It was a really, really fun thing to do, and lovely as always seeing both of you and chatting with both of you.
EyeCan wants to know what you think. Please send your comments on today's episode or any suggestions you may have for topics or features to communications@cos-sco.ca, and we'll try to incorporate them into future episodes.
Season 3 of the EyeCan podcast is brought to you by Bayer Ophthalmology. Thank you for your support.
Thank you to the Canadian Ophthalmological Society.
The EyeCan podcast is written and directed by Kim Teitler and produced by John Allaire from Allaire Strategic Works.